The air hung heavy with dread. The four stallions, wild and untamed, pawed at the blood-soaked ground beneath them. Their nostrils flared, muscles rippled like coiled steel beneath sweat-drenched hides. The crimson light of a dying sun bathed the scene in a macabre glow, as though the heavens themselves recoiled at what was about to unfold. Tied between them, her arms and legs pulled in opposing directions, stood a woman who once ruled entire kingdoms with an iron will. Queen Brunhilda, a mother of kings, a regent who defied the power-hungry men of her age, and now little more than a trembling body about to be ripped into four shuddering pieces. The crowd leaned in, hungry for blood. The signal would come, the horses would bolt, and flesh would tear like fragile silk. But how did it come to this? How does a sovereign queen become nothing more than a public trophy for brutal vengeance? This is the story of Queen Brunhilda, and the price of power in a world ruled by treachery. Dark context build up. The Frankish kingdoms, a place where ambition was currency and betrayal was its price. Brunhilda of the Visigoths was born into this reality long before she set foot on Frankish soil. Even as a child in the Iberian Peninsula, she saw how power devoured the soft-hearted. She watched fathers sacrifice sons to secure treaties. She learned early, justice was an illusion written by victors. When she was offered to marry King Sigebert of Austrasia, it was not a romance. It was a calculated transaction. Yet even as a pawn, Brunhilda saw an opportunity. She entered the Frankish court not as a timid foreign bride, but as a player, one determined to rise. At first she played her role perfectly, regal, gracious, intelligent. The Frankish nobles underestimated her. Perhaps that was her greatest weapon, being underestimated. Her husband admired her counsel. She advised on diplomacy, secured alliances, and carefully built her own web of influence. But power attracts rivals like blood attracts wolves. In Neustria, Queen Fredegund, brutal, cunning, and born from the lower ranks, seethed at Brunhilda's elegance and pedigree. The two women embodied opposite forces, one the polished queen, the other the ruthless street fighter. Their Cold War became personal. Fredegund struck first. Sigebert was assassinated, murdered through carefully orchestrated intrigue. And with him, Brunhilda's official shield vanished. Most queens would retreat to silent widowhood. Not Brunhilda. Her transformation began. Where once she was consort, now she became regent. For her son, for her grandsons, for her great-grandsons. She became a fixture of the throne, outliving multiple generations of kings, each weaker than the last. But every victory came at a cost. To the public, Brunhilda became less a queen, more a phantom, always hovering behind the throne, always manipulating from the shadows. What drove her? Was it love for her bloodline? Or was it the intoxicating thrill of absolute power? Perhaps both. Power is seductive, and like all who grasp it tightly, she likely began to believe only she could protect the realm from falling apart. Perhaps that was her fatal delusion. The nobles hated her not merely for her gender or foreign roots. They hated her for surviving too long. She robbed them of their turn at power. The bishops bristled under her authority, seeing a woman who dared dictate to God's representatives on earth. And the commoners, oh, they are always the easiest to manipulate. Rumors spread that she was a witch, a poisoner, a serpent who devoured her own kin for power, and perhaps in part these rumors were not entirely false. History is rarely black and white, and neither was Brunhilda. There were executions, there were exiles. There were whispered confessions extracted under torture. Her reign as regent wasn't marked solely by diplomacy. It was also marked by fear. But even fear can lose its sting when the court fills with young, ambitious men who see an aging queen as an obstacle rather than a sovereign. The web of loyalty she had so carefully spun was fraying. Old enemies waited for an opening, and among them, one man prepared to finish what Fredegund had started, King Clothar II. The storm was coming, and it would be far more savage than even Brunhilda had ever seen. Power struggle and ambush. Brunhilda ruled longer than most kings. She had survived assassination plots, palace coups, even the venom of Queen Fredegund. But the longer she held power, the more unnatural it seemed in the eyes of her enemies. A woman, foreign-born, outlasting generation after generation of men, that alone was enough to fuel resentment. But Brunhilda did more than survive, she ruled. For decades, her sharp mind kept fragile alliances together. She played noble houses like pieces on a chessboard, maneuvering bishops, generals, and court advisors into checkmate. But as the years passed, so too did her circle of loyalists thin out. The sons and grandsons she had once protected began to see her not as a guardian, but as a cage. Around her, a new generation of nobles was rising. Ambitious, restless, hungry for land and titles denied to them by Brunhilda's iron grip. Many of these young lords had grown up hearing tales of their fathers' disgrace, their family lands stripped, their privileges revoked under her regency. For them, removing Brunhilda wasn't just ambition, it was vengeance. Whispers once confined to dark corners now slipped openly through court halls. Murmurs of witchcraft, of unnatural influence over kings, of secret affairs with advisors and bishops. The church, always wary of a woman who dared challenge its moral authority, fanned these flames. Behind sanctimonious sermons about divine order lay very earthly ambitions for power. But the most dangerous threat came from blood itself. King Clothar II, son of Fredegund, the old enemy, had waited patiently in the shadows. Where his mother had fought Brunhilda through open violence, Clothar used time. He watched her grow older, watched her make enemies, watched the nobles grow restless under her rule. And when the fractures were wide enough, he moved. Alliances were struck in secret. Promises of restored lands, pardoned exiles, and noble privileges were exchanged behind closed doors. Clothar positioned himself not just as a king, but as a liberator, the one who would free the Frankish realm from Brunhilda's tyranny. Her own descendants failed her. The younger branches of her family, once reliant on her counsel, were swayed by promises of autonomy. Blood loyalty gave way to personal ambition. Perhaps they had grown tired of her hand guiding every decision, tired of living in the long shadow of a matriarch who refused to relinquish control. It was betrayal in its purest form, not from distant enemies, not from foreign invaders, but from within her own bloodline. Brunhilda, for all her cunning, may have believed she could outlast every plot. After all she had before. She had watched rivals crumble, watched enemies die mysterious deaths, watched powerful men beg for her mercy. She had become almost mythic in her survival. Perhaps that was her greatest miscalculation, believing that survival was victory. But every empire has its breaking point, and for Brunhilda, the breaking point came when even her closest allies began to turn their backs. One by one, noble families pledged themselves to Clothar. Bishops blessed his cause from the pulpits. Even members of her own court slipped away under the cover of night, leaving her palace halls emptier by the day. In the final days before her capture, Brunhilda stood not as a queen, but as a woman encircled. Her web of alliances, once intricate and unbreakable, now hung in tatters. The enemies she had outsmarted for decades had finally gathered into one force, united by their shared hatred of her. And as Clothar's armies marched toward Austrasia, the once defiant regent was offered no grand final battle, no chance for one last political maneuver. Her own people opened the gates. There was no resistance. She was seized, stripped not only of her titles, but of the illusion of control she had so fiercely defended. Her fate was no longer hers to negotiate. The court would not simply kill her. That would be too merciful. Her enemies wanted more. They wanted to erase her very legacy. And for that, they would devise a punishment so savage, so grotesque, that even in death she would serve as a warning to any who dared rise as she had. The spectacle was being prepared. Public humiliation and execution set up. The fall of a monarch rarely happens in silence. The people demand spectacle, and the court, always eager to satisfy the thirst of the masses, understood this well. Brunhilda, once seated upon thrones of marble, now found herself dragged through the dirt like a common criminal. Her royal garments were stripped away, replaced with coarse cloth barely covering her aging body. The heavy crown that once adorned her head gone. In its place, a tangled mess of grey hair clung to her face, wet with sweat, spit, and humiliation. The streets of Austrasia overflowed with jeering crowds. They shouted curses, some of which she had heard whispered in court for years, now screamed with open hatred. Stones, rotten fruit, and clumps of filth rained down upon her as soldiers paraded her slowly through the city. Children joined the chorus, laughing, mimicking their parents' venom. Priests stood on corners, solemnly proclaiming her fall as divine justice. Many in the crowd had once cheered for her, had once prayed for her strength during invasions, thanked her for stability, for roads, for trade. But loyalty is fragile, and the stories they had been fed in recent years were far more intoxicating than gratitude. She was no longer their protector. She was a foreign witch, a usurper who held the realm in unnatural bondage. They called her the Serpent of Austrasia, the Poison Queen, the Mother of Heresy. They accused her of seducing priests, sacrificing children, consorting with demons. The rumors were absurd, but they spread because they were delicious. And deep down, perhaps many in the crowd knew they were lies, but what mattered wasn't truth. It was that hating her made them feel powerful, as if they too, for a brief moment, could strike down a monarch who once ruled beyond their reach. The court did not stop with public humiliation. Inside the palace, Clothar's advisors debated how to dispose of her. A simple beheading, too quick, burning at the stake, too traditional, poison, too quiet. No, this moment required something unforgettable. A method so horrific that her very name would inspire dread for generations. And then someone proposed it. She would be torn apart by wild horses, not just killed, unmade. The The sentence was unprecedented in its cruelty, but it served a purpose. The nobles wanted to send a message not just to Brunhilda's allies, but to any future regent who might dream of wielding power beyond their station. The preparations began immediately. 4 powerful stallions were selected, their strength tested, their temperaments ensured to be wild and uncontrollable. The ropes were braided thick, designed not to snap. The execution ground was chosen just outside the city walls, where the entire population could gather to witness the spectacle. Even among Clothar's soldiers, there was unease. Some whispered privately that the punishment was excessive, that Brunhilda, for all her sins, had still been a queen, that this display was less justice, more theater, but their voices remained low. No one dared challenge the will of the king, not now, not when the mob was so inflamed. And so the day approached. As the sun rose on the morning of her execution, the city was electric with anticipation. Thousands gathered, filling the fields, climbing trees, clambering onto rooftops for a better view. Vendors sold food and drink as if preparing for a festival. Children squealed with excitement. The execution had become an event, one that would be retold in taverns and markets for years to come. Brunhilda was brought forth, bound tightly, her wrists and ankles already attached to the ropes that snaked out toward the impatient horses. She stood, bloodied and exhausted, but unbroken. Her face, bruised and pale, carried an expression few expected: contempt. She scanned the crowd, locking eyes with some of the nobles who once dined at her table, now smirking behind silk robes. She saw bishops, their hands clasped piously, pretending to mourn as they watched with satisfaction. She saw the peasants, wide-eyed, hungry for blood they could not spill themselves. And then, slowly, she raised her chin. For all that had been done to her, she would not beg, she would not scream. They could tear her body apart, but they would not have her dignity. That she would carry into death. The handlers approached the horses, tightening the ropes one final time. The crowd leaned forward, breath held. The executioner raised his arm, waiting for the king's signal. And in that final moment of eerie stillness, the weight of decades collapsed into a single, terrible instant. Full brutal execution. The signal came. With a sharp crack of the whip, the horses reared violently. Their hooves slammed against the earth as they screamed into the air, muscles straining against the ropes. The handlers released them all at once, and 4 bodies of pure instinct bolted in opposite directions. For the briefest moment, Brunhilda's body held. Her arms jerked first, yanked sharply forward, forcing her torso to twist unnaturally. Her legs snapped in opposite directions, feet dragging across the dirt. The tendons in her shoulders stretched like ropes nearing their breaking point. Joints wrenched from sockets. The crowd gasped, their bloodlust momentarily caught between horror and fascination. The horses bucked and pulled harder. One stumbled, then regained its footing, surging forward. That was all it took. The first tear ripped through muscle like wet fabric. Her left arm dislocated entirely, twisting in a grotesque angle. The shriek that burst from her lungs was raw, animalistic, unlike any sound she had ever made as queen, mother, or regent. But the horses did not pause. They pulled again. Her right leg snapped with an audible crack. Bones splintered beneath tightening skin as ligaments burst apart. Blood sprayed into the dirt, staining the ground with each brutal tug. The handlers did nothing to control the animals. They simply let the violence unfold. The crowd, once gleeful, fell into a strange quiet. Only the hooves thundered, ropes creaked, and her screams filled the void. The ropes cut into her flesh, pulling skin apart, exposing raw muscle, white bone, torn sinew. Her chest twisted unnaturally as her spine began to separate under the impossible strain. Veins snapped open like frayed cords. Her body no longer resembled anything human, but a grotesque puppet stretched toward the breaking point. Her screams weakened into ragged gasps, then silence, but the horses did not stop. With one final pull, her body tore apart completely, 4 gruesome remnants yanked free from each other, flung into the dirt. Blood pooled beneath the severed limbs, steaming under the sun. Bits of flesh hung from the ropes like trophies. The crowd stood frozen. For a moment, no one cheered, no one spoke. Even those who had called her a witch, a tyrant, a monster, now stood face to face with a level of cruelty that unsettled something primal within them. It was done. The queen who had once ruled nations was reduced to scattered pieces of torn flesh and shattered bone. The ultimate humiliation, the ultimate erasure. The executioners moved forward silently, detaching the bloodied ropes. The horses, still snorting and restless, were led away. In the stillness that followed, the air was heavy with a strange kind of shame, not for Brunhilda, but for those who had cheered so eagerly for this moment. They had been fed their spectacle, but now that it was real, vividly, grotesquely real, it tasted different. This was not justice. This was annihilation. And though the crowd would eventually leave, though songs would be written mocking her name, though nobles would claim victory, some part of this horror would linger in the conscience of the realm. A silent knowing that in their hunger for her destruction, they had witnessed something that revealed far more about themselves than about the queen they despised. Aftermath and psychological ending. The ground was still wet when the nobles reconvened. Clotha II sat triumphantly on his newly secured throne. The final obstacle to his undisputed rule had been torn apart, piece by piece, in full view of the realm. The message was clear: no one, not even the mother of kings, was safe from his will. But as days turned into weeks, something peculiar settled over the court. Brunhilda was dead, yet her presence lingered. Not as a haunting spirit, but as a heavy shadow embedded deep within the realm's conscience. Whispers began to circulate behind the palace walls. Some claimed that her execution had invited divine wrath. Crops withered unexpectedly that year. A strange sickness swept through parts of the countryside. Cattle died suddenly in neighboring provinces. Superstitious peasants whispered that Brunhilda's curse had poisoned the land. Of course, such events were not uncommon in the volatile medieval world. But timing is a dangerous thing. When misfortune follows cruelty, even the most rational minds struggle to ignore patterns. In private chambers, some of Clothar's advisors exchanged uneasy glances. Had they gone too far, executions were common. Even beheadings of royalty, while rare, were not unheard of. But to dismember a queen so publicly, it had crossed a line. It was not justice, it was indulgence. And indulgence has a way of staining the soul. The court may have removed Brunhilda's body, but they could not erase what she represented. The terrifying resilience of a woman who refused to be broken by a world designed to devour her. Her reign was marked by ruthlessness, yes, but also by vision, by reforms, by strength that outlasted generations of men who could not match her. Her enemies had defeated her flesh, but not her legend. In taverns and marketplaces, commoners still told her story. Some mocked her, but others, especially women and those who had once benefited from her reforms, spoke with a kind of somber awe. They remembered the roads she built, the laws she strengthened, the order she maintained amidst constant civil strife. The nobles, too, found little peace in her absence. With Brunhilda gone, the fragile balance she had maintained between warring factions quickly began to crumble. Old rivalries reignited. Greedy lords once united in hatred for her turned upon each other like starved dogs fighting over scraps. Clothar's reign, though longer than most, was not immune to this instability. His bloodline, too, would face betrayals, assassinations, and endless succession crises. In time, even his descendants would fall into the same violent cycles that had destroyed those before him. It is a cruel irony of history. Sometimes those who are most vilified in life become cautionary saints in death. Brunhilda's execution was meant to be the end of her story. Instead, it became her monument. For centuries after, chroniclers would debate her legacy. Was she a tyrant, a witch, or simply a woman who dared to rule in a world where women were meant to serve? Perhaps the most uncomfortable truth for her enemies was this: they had not destroyed her legacy. They had only made it impossible to forget. And so the Frankish kingdom marched forward, forever stained by the memory of the queen they tore apart and the brutal theater they staged to erase her. History often praises those who seize power. It tells their victories, carves their names into stone, and paints their portraits in gold. But beneath every polished crown lies a trail of blood that no monument can fully conceal. Brunhilda's story is not unique. In the brutal theater of medieval royalty, kings and queens rose and fell not through divine right, but through ambition, betrayal, and violence. And as long as there was power to seize, there were always hands willing to spill blood to claim it. If you thought Brunhilda's end was horrifying, her story is but one thread in a far darker tapestry of royal cruelty. Join us as we continue to uncover the most twisted, brutal, and unforgiving stories of power in Tortures of the Crown. Subscribe and descend deeper into the darkest corners of history.